It's the After Show with TelecomTV's Guy Daniels and Ray Maistre.
Welcome to the After Show on Telecom TV. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content, and we are broadcasting live and waiting to hear from you at the end of day one of the Telecom TV Summit on Open RAN. And we have a great lineup of guests joining us today, and we're going to answer as many of your questions as we can. So if you haven't yet got in touch with us, then do so now, and the sooner the better. Do not leave it too late. Act now, avoid disappointment. There's a form on the website below this video. Right, it's time to introduce my co-host for the After Show. It's Ray Maistre, Editorial Director at Telecom TV. Now, Ray, we opened up the summit today with a look at the commercial viability of Open RAN and the role of the RIC. A strong start that's already generated a great response from viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. Two key topics for the operator and vendor community. How important will the RIC be to Open RAN developments? And so importantly, the economic case for Open RAN. It doesn't get much bigger than that, really, does it? And we also talked to Vodafone's Iago Tenorio to get his latest views on open disaggregated radio access networks and Vodafone's progress, and also to find out about his new job. And if you don't know about it, please do check out the video. Iago's CV is growing.
Ooh, intriguing. I predict a flurry of LinkedIn invite requests heading his way soon. Meanwhile, let's see who's linked in with us today. And joining us live on the After Show are Sachin Katti, who is Advisor for Strategy at VMware and the co-chair of the Technical Steering Committee at the ORAN Alliance. Neil McRae, Managing Director, Architecture and Strategy and Chief Architect at BT. John Baker, SVP Business Development at Mavenir. Colin Bryce, Senior Director Product Line at CommScope. Terje Jensen, SVP Head of Global Network Architecture and Director of the 5G Readiness Strategic Programme, Technologies and Services, Telenor. And Raja Vatka, who is Chief Technology Officer at Juniper Networks. Hello everyone, very good to see you all again. Lots of audience questions to get through in the next 45 minutes or thereabouts. So Ray, over to you to start us off.
Okay, great. Thanks, Guy. Colin, we're going to start with the first question for you today. And that question is, who will do the integration for all these disaggregated boxes that come together for an Open RAN system? Who's in charge of fixing the problems? It's not the first time we've had this question. It's not the last time. But Colin, what is the answer?
What is the answer? Well, it's certainly thanks, Ray, it's certainly the $64,000 question, not just in terms of the operation and integrity of Open RAN, but I think also for suppliers like ourselves at CommScope, it's also going to inform the supply chain and who we end up selling product to, which is obviously part of the whole process of ensuring Open RAN happens. I think we think very much about integration testing and getting these entities, the RU, the CU, the DU, the RIC, all talking together as IoT testing as part of this. And I think initially the community labs and the open test integration centres being organised by TIP and ORAN are certainly helpful in that aspect. And we've been involved in plug fests, for example, already as part of this process. In terms of commercial deployment, though, we're not just talking about that IoT, but we're talking about the integration of disaggregated software onto hardware and middleware. We're talking about operation and maintenance management, and we're talking about ongoing testing in terms of regression testing, backward compatibility testing, capacity testing, all of these things that are done today in the networks. So we see four potential integrators. One, the operators themselves, and we've certainly got some evidence that greenfield operators are already doing a lot of this integration on their own. And some of the big operators, certainly some of the big European operators, are investing heavily in their own capabilities to do aspects of the integration testing. We think some OEMs, some existing OEMs, but who want to play a bigger part in mobile infrastructure going forward and basing that on Open RAN, they may not want to supply all the entities themselves, so they may create these ecosystems of suppliers and act as the major integrators. We think some of the IT integrators, those companies that are already involved in large IT integration projects, could play a part as integrators of Open RAN. And finally, the hyperscalers, perhaps they'll be more involved in private networks and neutral hosting networks, but we think they could play a part as well. So it remains to be seen exactly how this will evolve, but we think it will be a combination of those four types of players who will become the major integrators and take overall supply responsibility.
Okay, thanks, Colin. And I think if it was just a $64,000 question, there'd be some very disappointed integrators out there, that's for sure. Raj, let's come to you. Who do you think is going to be the key to the integration efforts in Open RAN?
Yeah, so let me start by stating that we need to avoid the mistake we made with OpenStack with Telco Cloud, where the integration was the biggest challenge and the resiliency of the infrastructure after it was integrated was a challenge. Reason for that is that OpenStack never standardized lots of components and the interfaces. With ORAN, the approach that the operators are taking in the alliances that they're forming is that take a cloud native approach. So if you start with Kubernetes as the basis for hosting all of these different components, then you get an advantage. You don't need so many open source packages like Cassandra, MongoDB, or RabbitMQ. Instead, Kubernetes comes with automated intent-based lifecycle management. So I think that has to be the first criteria to make it easy to integrate and operate. And then secondly, I think the single neck to choke model required to provide the reliability will ultimately come from complete solution providers. So they are the traditional system integrators evolving into providing solutions. So those are the two things that will happen in my opinion.
So yeah, let's come to you.
Just to support Colin, I think in the types of integrator roles, what we have seen so far. But I think it's important what you also mentioned, that we see a difference between, let's call it east-west integration between different functions on the same level, and also north-south integration, which is kind of between different layers, if you want. And we also seen, I've been in discussions with the companies which actually are starting to pre-integrate some of the components, in particular with the north-south integration. For example, on some of the ORAN components on the cloud environment, for example, and also with RIC components and management systems and so on. So it's interesting to figure out, and observe these kind of movements between smaller and bigger companies on pre-integration and building those relationships, even without even operators, pushing that into a specific case. So I think that's good actually to see that motions as we see, at least within the landscape of the different companies.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Terje. And Neil, you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably to a lot kind of reinforce what Raj says. I think we're running a big Open RAN RFP right now, and what's really clear is how unintegrated it is. And I think, from a success point of view, those operators and those vendors that get together and come up with a solution that they're willing to underwrite are going to be the ones that lead this. And I think the danger of this is I suspect you might find it's one of the traditional vendors that does that first, like Nokia, even potentially Ericsson, perhaps not ORAN, but certainly an open approach. So I think, ORAN needs to watch out for those guys solving this problem before they've got momentum in the wider ORAN and Open RAN ecosystem. Because if I know that I just have to phone Pekka at Nokia to get anything fixed, that's a big kind of lift off our heads or in dealing with any problems or issues that occur.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be interesting to see who comes to the top of the pile in terms of making these moves and sorting out these integration challenges. Okay, thanks, Neil. Guys, so let's move on to question 2 from today's audience.
Yep, thank you, Ray. Next question we've got from our audience. John, I'm going to direct this one to you first, if I may. The questioner asks, as I understand it, Open RAN is not a technology that can substitute 2G and 3G. Will mobile operators therefore have 2 sets of parallel base stations? For example, one set running 2G, 3G and another running 4G, 5G. And the rental cost to tower companies, for example, for sites and energy consumption is already high and would be even higher with the second network on the same site. John, have you any thoughts, or can you clarify the situation here with legacy generations of cellular?
Yeah, so let me start off. It's a good question. Let me start off with the interface issue. So O-RAN Alliance really sort of concentrated on 4G, 5G. So there is no O-RAN Alliance specification at this point for 2G and 3G. Now, that said, we've, and I'll talk a little bit about Mavenir for a bit, we've implemented 2G and can do 3G on a virtualized containerized platform. It does run a different interface to the O-RAN interface, but it runs alongside it. And we've offered our spec publicly to anybody that wants it, and to try and get it back into the O-RAN Alliance to get the 2G, 3G spec actually published. But so from a virtualized, containerized form, you can run 2G and 3G, 4G, 5G all side by side. You don't need 2 separate networks per se to actually go do that. But back to some of the way the questions sort of coming out, and it's been a topic in the some press articles in the last 2 weeks. And firstly, one response is, look, don't think the old conventional silo approach in the sense that everything has to come from one vendor. Again, Open RAN is about vendor diversification, and I can take a 2G virtual element from one vendor, and I can put it alongside a 4G virtual element from somebody else. So that type of scenario is going to happen. In terms of where some of the applications are going, for 4G, 5G, and some of the frequency bands, then that may require new radios sitting at the cell site. So typically, GSM is down at band 8, and there's not necessarily enough spectrum there. So different radios are being used at different frequency bands. So in reality, there's no new equipment necessarily going on the site. And in fact, the fact that I can put my CU/DU back in a data center is not necessarily additional power consumption at the site either. So there's no disadvantage in the way these things are being broken up from a power consumption perspective, and from a technology perspective. Yeah, 2G will definitely be there in terms of virtualized form, and 3G in countries that need it.
Thank you, John. Thanks for clarifying that. As I say, it was a good question, and I think it's very much a case of watch this space. I'm sure we're going to get some developments here in the near future. Unless anybody else wants to pitch in with that question, I don't think so. In that case, we've got a lot more questions to get through. So, Ray, let me hand right back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Guy. Our next viewer question is going to come initially to you, Neil. And the question is, and this is somebody who's watched the panel that you were on, that we broadcast earlier today. The question is, I tend to agree with Neil about the long path still to go with Open RAN. What is your assumption, Neil, as to how long that path is in terms of years before Open RAN is ready for commercial deployment?
It's a challenging question, because it assumes that O-RAN is kind of one thing that, you stick it in the oven, you turn it to 200 degrees, and half an hour later it's ready to bake, so ready to eat. And the way I would put it is, I think there are some places where Open RAN is deployable now. So if you wanted to do neutral hosts or small cells, actually working pretty great right now, and we've done a lot of trials in that space. I think where we see challenges is kind of bigger, denser deployments where there's still a lot of work to do, particularly in the kind of acceleration space and in the scalability space, and in things like power conservation in particular. So, my take is that we'll see Open RAN really blossom when we really move to the next generation of technology. So, 5G, we started talking about 5G almost 5 years ago, and we're still at the early deployment stages of 5G. And I think, we'll start to see some Open RAN be deployed over the next few years. But I think, the full, really supported by many organizations and many vendors, I think it's probably towards the tail end of 5G into 6G. Although I do hope there isn't a 6G, I hope there's more of an evolution. But it's probably within the next 5 to 10 years that we'll really see momentum on this happen. And I think some of the challenges and some of the hard yards that need to be tackled, I think, is really starting to come to light. Again, huge amount of great work going on across industry, a lot of collaboration, a lot of testing and deployment. But I think we've still got a reasonably long journey before, before I buy, 4 Open RAN parts from 4 different vendors and plug them in and it all works. Even in the kind of cloud native side of that, it's still very challenging to get, a platform from one vendor to work with another. If you're using DPDK or any of those technologies, it's not as plug and play as we'd like. So I think we've got a lot of learning to go through that. But, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a bad thing. If you just think how long it's taken us to get to the radio efficiency of today, that's a 30, 40-year journey. So trying to do what we're doing in a short space of time is still, pretty ambitious and frankly very exciting.
Absolutely. Thanks, Neil. Okay, a lot of people wanting in on this question. We'll come to Raj first, and then we'll go John, Colin, and Sachin. So Raj, come to you.
Yeah, so I do agree with Neil that it's a long journey, but I think it's going to happen faster than we think in terms of stages at which it happens. So let me give you a concrete example, right? If you look at the virtualized cell site routers based on Intel FlexRAN architecture, where you take a ODU, combine that with a routing stack, with data plane. We are doing that with Rakuten. We announced it with Intel and Rakuten today, that virtualized cell site routers can be deployed today, which is an example of first step of ORAN disaggregation, right? You're taking ODU from some vendor, you're taking routing stack and data plane from somebody, combine that with the open x86 architecture, and you have a very cost efficient virtualized cell site router that can go to thousands of instances starting early next year. So I do believe that that's the first step in this long journey. The second stage will come with the RIC, because RIC in this particular model allows you to control multiple base stations in a region. That leads to lots of optimization of how you use the radio spectrum, how you do scheduling, how do you achieve energy efficiency. So once those proof points are in place, I think the things will accelerate, because the traditional operators are going to look at this as a better way to do things than radio access networks are deployed today. So that's the only thing.
Okay, thanks, Raj. John, let's come to you next. How many years?
Yeah, so
I know you're going to say 0.
No, well, in some respects it is 0, but in others it's a journey. And we've always said that Open RAN is not a revolution; it's an evolution. And we still very much maintain that. You're going to see some, hopefully very soon, Dish launch, and we've seen Rakuten launch with their version of Open RAN and how they've deployed it. So it is happening, and there's a number of other big ones around the world that are coming together. So That said, now if you talk to the current incumbents, their wish is it will never happen, and you're seeing marketing strategies around Cloud RAN, which is confusing the marketplace yet again. That we got Cloud RAN and it's open. It's open to one vendor. So we're going to be living in that era for probably the next year or so until some of this gets sorted. But it is a journey. And then to a point Neil raised about power consumption, this power consumption thing is a bit of nonsense in the sense that the radios at the cell towers today are identical to the ones being used in Open RAN. So, I strongly argue there's a great deal of research that needs to be done to improve radio technology to make them lower power consumption and more green, which has been prohibited or inhibited by the current incumbent. So power consumption applies to whether it's closed or open. From an Open RAN perspective, then we've got to take the benefits of innovation and the wider supply chain to work at some of these issues.
Yeah, thanks, John. Let's come to Colin next, and then we'll come down to Sachin and then Terje. So, Colin.
So I sort of agree with Neil as well. This isn't a big bang theory that all of this happens at once. And I think, certainly from the radio perspective that we're working on, I think, legacy radios are available today, which are compliant to O-RAN. We expect to see 5G and massive MIMO beamformers coming into play during the next year. So aspects of the network could be deployed fairly quickly. I think the other aspect is, does Open RAN need to hit the ground with all the feature sets, all the capability that current OEM proprietary solutions have? And that's obviously a challenge because it's hitting a moving target. So I think we may see Open RAN being deployed quite aggressively in certain aspects of the network, so particularly maybe rural, more suburban areas where there's less need for all the capacity features. And that would be a good thing to understand from the operators. Are there particular focuses that they would like the Open RAN community to really try and deliver first, as opposed to trying to say you need to deliver everything that a Nokia or an Ericsson can deliver today, which is a challenge.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said that, Colin, because that's exactly what our poll is about during this summit, and we'll be coming to the early results of that poll quite soon. But first, we need to come to Sachin and then Terje on this question. So Sachin, how long is this piece of string that is Open RAN?
Thanks. So I think everyone has already answered the question, which is depends on where you're starting from. So if you're starting from scratch as a greenfield network, I think you can go now, as you're seeing with Dish and Rakuten. But in other cases, I think you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. I'm seeing operators take interesting approaches, right? So some brownfield operators are starting with virtualization, basically Cloud RAN, and an open front-haul interface. Actually, the open front-haul interface with the radio disaggregation is almost happening universally. I think every operator is doing that. But they're using the off-the-shelf silicon for running these workloads. That's happening. I think some other operators are starting from the top, which is let's open up the management plane first. So let's start with the SMO layer, and then we will go down into the stack to introduce things like the RIC and maybe even cloudify the RAN. So I think it depends on every situation, but it's a gradual evolution, which will suddenly feel like a revolution all of a sudden. So.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sachin. And Terje, let's come to you next.
Yeah, now just coming back to Neil, I guess Neil may be disagreeing with what I'm saying, but I agree perfectly that this is a long-term journey in a way. So it's a perspective we need to have on where we want to end up. And of course, I also fully agree that achieving the ultimate Open RAN plug and play, mix and match everything is probably a few years ahead of us. But having said that, I think Colin mentioned that. Please keep in mind that, in my mind at least, that Open RAN consists of a number of components. There are, in my mind at least, different level of maturity of these different components. And if you mix that with the different application areas, it's also what we see that some of the operators have started deploying some of these components already.
So I think there are opportunities, and probably quite more optimistic, if we might call it like that, when it comes to what we can do today, and definitely also next year in some of these cases. So I think I mentioned that earlier also, in that we are not talking about only the wide area public network and the most advanced and power-hungry configurations. I think it's also important to keep in mind that the other applications areas, talking about local networks, private networks, so special cases networks, and so on, where we might find, that the requirements actually are lower when it comes to capacity, maybe, and so forth. So I think it's important to keep all these perspectives into the discussion about the timing and maturity and what are the steps.
Absolutely, lots of parameters. And Neil, I think we're just going to come back to you to wrap up this topic before we move on, because we don't have a 3-hour show, unfortunately.
I know. Someone bring me a radio that can beat. Someone bring me an ORAN radio that can beat Huawei's current power delivery. I've asked this many times. No one ever knocks on my door, and I think that's in this world, especially recently with energy prices going up by almost 30%. It's an increasingly challenging area. I do agree. Yes, are there other things in ORAN and Open RAN that are moving around? Cell site router disaggregation, absolutely. But to be honest with you, that is, in some respects, that's almost, whilst it's helping the build a radio network, it's almost parallel to it. And there are many solutions to bring down costs to make things more effective in that space. What I'm really interested in is how do I connect my customers' wireless devices to the network using a platform that's sustainable, that's easily deployable, that's widely available, and that's easy to operate. And that's the part of Open RAN that I'm most interested in, as opposed to these kind of other problems that, to some extent, I'm not really sure that I need to fix them right now.
Okay, thanks, Neil. I feel we could have an entire program just based around this question, but we do need to move on. And I'm sure we'll come back to many of these points as well in some of the other questions. So, Guy, I'm going to hand over to you for our next audience question.
Thanks, Ray. I was enjoying that. As you say, the next summit, we'll have an entire panel devoted to this one. Don't you worry. Sachin, I'm going to direct the next question to you first, and it is as follows. How important is standardization in order to bring ORAN to life? Or will quasi-standards based on a vendor deployment be the solution that makes Open RAN a success?
Well, as the chair of the ORAN Alliance, I think standardization is paramount. Otherwise, we will end up with fragmentation, especially as we're talking about interoperable multi-vendor deployments, having the ability to mix and match, plug and play. The first condition that's needed for that is standardized interoperable specs. That's not enough. As we discussed earlier, we need to actually be able to perform testing, because even if you have a specification and someone is compliant with the specification, there's always issues when you put things together. Do they actually work as expected? So you need testing to go along with the standardized specs, but standardization is absolutely critical. One comment I'll make, though, is that there's so much excitement around what Open RAN and all of these components are going to be doing for the operators that certain vendors are racing ahead and providing pre-standard implementations of many of these components with maybe unstandardized interfaces. But I think that's where we are making sure, as part of the ORAN Alliance, that we bring everyone together, even if technology is racing ahead of the standardized specs, trying to make sure that we incorporate that into the specifications. So absolutely critical to make sure that everything is interoperable and we truly get to that multi-vendor deployment that we all desire.
Thank you, Sachin. Yes, standardization critical, but as you say, when the technology is so interesting and it's got so much interest from the community, you do get those vendors who want to accelerate and go faster, don't you? Colin, let's get some thoughts from you on this.
So I think my answer to that is good standardization is vital. Bad standardization can limit innovation and can stifle new methods of moving into bringing new aspects to the network. So I think, and we have already got some examples of certain feature sets in our product line, which will be difficult to implement on the current O-RAN protocol standards. So as long as the standardization community stays open, I think that is absolutely vital to the deployment of Open RAN. But it's not just about the interoperability and the standards around the stack that are important. To Neil's point about the radio, I think we probably also need to create certain hardware and architectural standards around things like radio, and we need to do that to allow the silicon community enough volume to justify really developing high-spec ASICs and high-spec integrated silicon for the radios, because that's part of the process by which we'll make the radios more efficient, and particularly in terms of energy, but also make them much more cost-effective. So standards are vital, but we have to make sure we're doing it in the right way.
All right, thanks, Colin. And Raj, the importance of standardization to Open RAN, or as Colin would put it, good standardization.
Yeah, so I think I do want to point out one sort of gap in the O-RAN approach for standardization, which could limit us. So the best example of interoperable standards in the community, in my opinion, is IETF, which over the years had a requirement that at least 2 independently developed implementations have to be shown interoperating before a standard is certified and becomes a standard. I think a similar approach has to be taken for the O-RAN standardization. So plugfests are okay, testing solutions are okay, like TIP Alliance, but unless you require really 2 implementations actually interoperating in the field, you should not call it a standard, because otherwise people tend to create variations and soon the industry gets fragmented.
Thank you, Raj. And let's go straight over to John for some additional comments on this topic.
Yeah, a couple of comments, and I think Raj made a very good point there about interoperability between 2 different vendor implementations, and without stealing the thunder from the working dish, they are actually using 2 vendors for everything and proving interoperability against complete O-RAN interfaces. So that is starting to happen. But I'm going to put my board hat. I sit on the board of the O-RAN Policy Coalition. And Open RAN is about open and interoperable interfaces, nothing else. It doesn't tell you how to build it, doesn't tell you what to do with it. So, if we do nothing else apart from getting specifications that are open and interoperable, even from the proprietary guys, I think the industry's gone a long way to protecting its future. And, we wouldn't be ending up with a situation like we've got in the United States with the Huawei rip and replace, because there's no specifications. You can't take out any faulty equipment, and therefore you have to rip the whole network. So, I do really sort of bring it back to the whole policy issue that needs to be, that is being addressed on a global basis about open and, truly interoperable interfaces.
Oh yes, thank you, John. Well, we've got some more comments we want. Let me quickly go to Neil. We'll come to you in a second, and Sachin, but let's go to Terrier first.
Yeah, just I'll open up with that. I'm a firm believer of standardization. I think it's really helping building confidence among a broader ecosystem that this might be in demand, and then of course then also driving volumes, hopefully. But I think it's also very important, I think an earlier comment, that of course standardization is one thing, but how it's implemented, and not only implemented and integrated in the first version, but also how it's further developing and continuously evolving is also important to consider in the standardization. So of course we have seen quite a few standards which are coming with 7 or 8 options left to the implementation phase, which maybe doesn't really help the implementation and building that confidence. So I think it's important to keep not only the standardization as a first phase, but it's also looking into the standardization and how it can help on the longer run, and that could be throughout the releases or in other ways. But I think it's also good, as an earlier comment, that we can actually get a standard confirmed through the implementation, and thereby also demonstrating that there is a value. So it's also a closed loop on the way of working on standards, which probably are needed. And I think there are initiatives also in the Open RAN space on closing these loops. So it's not like a complete new idea. I think there's there are other arenas and also other initiatives actually to look into validation on these different areas.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, it's another question that's it's got everybody's interest. Neil, over to you for some more comments on this.
Yeah, I mean, look, standard. I've worked in standards for most of my telco career, and for sure they're important. But do you ever think that the guys in Apple are sitting around their unbelievable multi-billion-pound building, thinking, well, we need to think about how we standardize this before we launch it in the next iPhone? Because I'm pretty sure they don't. And I think this is where, not just in, and I'm probably more talking generically, but how do we get back to build an innovation, then standardize it, as opposed to work to the lowest common denominator collectively and then launch a standard? And I think too many of our standards have suffered from that. ORAN a little bit, probably not as much because there's more momentum about doing something. But I do think that's a key issue that needs to be overcome. And then I think the other thing is and Raj said it earlier, we're all standardizing on x86, and I don't know, but if anyone else saw it, but today the Intel CEO said that there's going to be big chip shortages. So just at the point in time where we need diversification, which is one of the big pushes of Open RAN, one of the key suppliers has basically said that we're going to have supply chip shortages. And when we look at this whole package, and when I look at what I'm trying to solve, I can't have a situation where I can't get equipment. And right now, there are too many of these kind of Intel-based solutions that are locked up in specific chipset manufacturers, and Intel's not the only one. Broadcom have had some challenges, as many challenges reported across the world, and it just isn't good enough that we're tied to kind of one or two platforms that really have a massive knock-on impact, not just in our industry, but in other industries as well.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Quick plug for Thursday's panel on silicon. Don't miss that one. We're on to our third or fourth question, but Sachin, let me come back to you for a quick roundup, because I know you want to just come back in on the end of this answer.
Yeah, no, just wanted to follow up on what Raj said, which is that working code beats standards anytime, right? So that's been the practice at IETF. And in fact, we are beginning to see that happen in parts of the ORAN Alliance. So things like the RIC, actually, there is working code implementations, people are building it, trialing it, and then coming to ORAN and saying, here, we actually already have an open interoperable implementation. Let's work together to standardize it. So I think that's absolutely the right approach. If we can pull it off on the software components of ORAN, it often tends to be much more harder to implement that kind of thing on the hardware side. So that's where I think you have to specify in advance a little bit, because the investment cycles to build even a prototype on the hardware can be quite significant.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Another great question there from our viewers. Ray, over to you.
Thanks, Guy. So, Terje, we're going to come to you first with this next question from our audience. And the question is, who is going to actually develop Open RAN-based services? Who will sell them, and what business models underlie these services? Is it going to be for corporate or the consumer market? And will the services only be available where the operators have implemented Open RAN? So I guess this may be a question that's kind of based around, the development of some of the apps that will specifically run on RAN intelligent controllers, and whether these might only be available where Open RAN is deployed. So any thoughts on that question at all?
Yeah, I think these are great questions, I think. And of course, it's something also we are battling with, because it's the whole revenue side around openness and Open RAN, which is, I think I mentioned that earlier today as well. It's a bit speculative how we see it. But what I can share with you is that we have been discussing with some of the application developer teams, and they look into Open RAN, in a particular RIC, and as you say, those applications there in the context of the local network or let's say the corporate market or enterprise market segments. So there are ideas there. They are relying on a kind of a version of digital twin combination with how can we optimize the customer experience on the local network, how can we push information and those kind of things, depending on the location. And quite a few of those parameters which goes into the way they are developing their applications there. So they are ecosystems and the application developer companies who are looking into some of these specifics there. Then we are also discussing with that in some of the enterprise pilots we are running, that they are quite big companies, and they typically are multinational companies which have their own in-house developer communities or developer teams, which are also looking into the similar things on the how they can use these kind of applications which are exposed then through APIs and further elaborating and getting closer to the radio conditions, for example, and using some of these parameters to offer very localized services, typically in a retailer shop or in also in some of the warehouse and the employees kind of settings. Of course, those are combination of in-house and maybe not external business models and let's earn a lot of money in that sense, but at least how to become more efficient and how to improve the customer experience. So that's what we are discussing on some of these use cases. Then I think it's from their point of view, they don't really care about Open RAN. And sorry to say, they just want to have exposed the right APIs. They want to have using the right features and the right parameters there. So I think it's important to keep in mind that they are really not that occupied with Open RAN as such. They just want to get access to the right interfaces. But there are ideas there. There are companies. Typically, most of these are smaller companies when you talk about standalone companies. And then, as I said, we also have discussions with some of the multinational bigger companies, enterprises, on which are looking into their own offerings and some of their own developer teams there, which can also use the same APIs. But of course, it's again, they don't really care about the radio technology, sorry to say. You just want to have the interface and the capabilities exposed, and that's how they take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Terje, for your insights there as to what Telenor is looking at. If we don't have any other responses to this question, then I will move on to, I beg your pardon, Colin. Colin, let's come to you.
I just think, the world's getting used to complex models now. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about COVID and the virology models around that. We've been working in an extremely complex model now for 20, 30 years, which is the radio environment close to the ground. It's hugely statistical, hugely complex. We try and model it with some fairly simplistic equations. But if we can extract more and more data on how UEs, how the radio channels are actually performing in real life, and we can apply artificial intelligence and machine learning to understand better ways of implementing radio in that environment, I think that is the future. And I think that's something that Open RAN can help to enable by ensuring that the data that we collect is actually relatively open and accessible to a vast range of different developers who can approach the problem in different ways. And I think that's something which we may find Open RAN delivers that much more effectively than we currently think it might.
Okay, interesting. Thanks, Colin. And Neil, it looked like you wanted to come in and there on the topic of data and collecting data.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's always difficult, especially to share it because it can be private. But actually, it was more about private networks. Don't underestimate what the customer wants when they want you to build a private network for them. We're seeing customers who have kind of named what vendor they want to work with, and I think that's it's a bit disappointing actually, because I'd rather that wasn't the case. But we're seeing that in some of our deployments on private networks already.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Raj, I think, did you want to come in on this? And if so, then we'll make that the final response to this question. Yeah, Raj, to you.
Now, I just want to add to what Colin was saying. This might be a controversial statement, but I really think the radio in the past has been given too much credit about having too much IP from traditional vendors, and radio is becoming a commodity. And when you compare that to other areas where you have commodity components, I think collecting data, applying machine learning techniques, that's where the value would be. So increasingly, ORAN, by opening up this ecosystem, will take advantage of more and more commodity radio parts coming from third parties. And then the real value will come by collecting data and applying machine learning techniques to optimize the network, provide value-added services, and so on.
Okay, thanks, Raj. And Guy, I'm looking in the corner of the studio. We have used up a lot of time. Do we have time to get one more question in and look at the Open RAN poll that we have?
Yeah, let's be cheeky. Let's try and squeeze in an extra question and get everybody's money's worth. Let's see if we can get this question in. It's a question, Raj, I'm going to try and put this to you first. The question from that audience is as follows. Telcos have been trying to court developers for years now through various initiatives and technologies, and the results have been largely disappointing. Why do we think that the emergence of the RIC and the RIC ecosystem will do any better?
Yeah. So the analogy I gave last time, I think, if you remember, was that what happened in two ecosystems, right? One is the so-called Wintel monopoly that created the PC ecosystem and created a huge open ecosystem of developers, right? Then we saw the similar thing happen with Apple-based, iPhone-based App Store and rise of the smartphones. I think the telcos themselves, in my opinion, and sorry, Neil, I don't mean any disrespect, the operators are not going to be able to do that themselves. They cannot rely on their own developers. And what ORAN is doing is creating a really first time an opportunity for the third party huge ecosystem of developers to bring in value, bring in software-based applications, XApps, RApps, even a RIC coming from different vendors. Those kind of opportunities will really offset the inability of the traditional telcos to do all the development internally, but start using an open ecosystem as it has happened in other parts of the industry, such as a PC and smartphone industry and so on.
Thank you, Raj. Neil, I'm sure you'd like to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've never kind of been a big believer that we're going to get hundreds of developers developing on a kind of telco cloud. I just don't think that's realistic, unless we can show them the money. So all the things that Raj mentioned, you know, the Wintel platform, loads of people got very rich from that. Same with Apple app development, and I think if there's value to be had, then it will come. But I tend to agree it's difficult. But I think for telcos of the future, you know, if our mission is to kind of write apps to optimize radio, then we're probably already out of business, because that can be the future, because there's never going to be enough value in that. Where we need to get to is, and you know, you'll have heard me say this on some of the 5G programs that you guys have ran. Where we need to get to is how do I bring my network of the future into a hospital and networkify the hospital? Make every aspect of what happens in a hospital or in a stadium or in a factory or in an airport, make every aspect of it controlled and managed by a network of capabilities. And that's what we as telcos are looking for. And I think Open RAN has a massive part to play in that, you know, in some of the infrastructure, but it's not going to be enough for us as telcos. We need to go one more step forward and help you know, these areas of things like healthcare become more network centric in the way that they manage patients, in the way that they manage their entire infrastructure, in the way that they you know, roll ambulances into the hospital and roll them out, and the same for factories. How do we use the network and the power of video to make factories that make things even better? And that's where telcos are going to get value. We're not going to get huge value from, you know, a few apps running on a RIC that runs in the macro network. Don't get me wrong, there's value to be had there, but do I see people paying more for that? Doesn't feel like it to me. And you know, that's where my kind of concern about private networks, if we're not able to go in there and build the private network we think a hospital needs, as opposed to, what a vendor's tried to sell them in terms of their own local capability, then I think we're probably in trouble. But, we're working on a couple of big private networks that really are extending the footprint and the engagement of telecommunications companies in a way that I would, 10 years ago, I would never have imagined. And personally, I've been to more industry shows that are nothing to do with telco. So, I've been and spoke about automated ports. I've been and spoke about automated healthcare and hospitals, all around the power of the network. And I think that's where the value of telecommunication operators has to go, because, just selling, fast speeds to your next phone, it's just not going to be enough for us to be able to continue to invest in the infrastructure the world needs.
Thanks very much, Neil. A couple more responses still to get through. So first of all, I'm going to head up to the top right to John.
Yeah, I just want to come back to one point really, which is the big differentiator about, why we can do this now and we couldn't do this 10 years ago, and it really is about open interfaces. The interfaces are becoming open, so developers know what they can develop against. What the transition that's going on in the telco network or the telco cloud is, you've got this web scale architecture platform, which is following a lot of the principles that were used in, the evolution of the internet. So, you've got a lot of history effectively from developers to rely on, and specifications being open now. People can work against open interfaces and don't need licenses and are not going to get blocked in bringing services. And I strongly believe the future of mobile operators are going to be able to compete, operator by operator on their own innovation through web scale applications, rather than having, all having the same through a common roadmap. So I think it's a bright future. I think software developers in telco operators, is an absolute must for competition, and certainly, hope to see in the next five plus years, where this is sort of all going to lead. But we're certainly opening up the industry.
Thank you, John. I'm going to head down to Terja for extra comments on this question. The question is all about courting developers and what the RIC can do to help that. Terja.
Yeah, I think we are coming from, at least some of us, from operator point of view, that we have just exposed something, either information or APIs, and then leave it to someone else to figure out what they want to do with it and what value they want to get out of that. And I think back to my earlier point as well, and building on what Neil was saying, even though I'm probably a bit more positive on some of the private network stuff, is that we are not really shaping now the questions on providing connectivity, for example, to a building or someone. But it's more like, what is the problem? What is the customer value we are bringing as an operator? And it's not only an operator, but it's actually a solution provider, if you want to phrase it like that. So we are raising the question, for example, on how can we improve the life of the patients, for example. And we have a public case now which is monitoring the heart of the ECG, for example, on patients, which are freely to move around. They don't have to stay in the beds in the hospital, for example. And the way, or we have another case, for example, on fish farming, is what like how can we improve the efficiency of feeding the fishes, for example, and just phrasing the questions and the job to be done in that way seems to be appealing to the software development community in a much larger extent than just providing connectivity or connecting some devices. So if you're phrasing the questions in the right way, it seems to be attracting the interest, at least in some of these use cases, what we are in dialogues on.
Great, thank you, Terja. And I'm leaving deliberately the final word on this subject to Sachin. So Sachin, thoughts about how Open RAN and the emergence of the RIC ecosystem can encourage more developers into telecoms?
Thanks, guys. So I think I like to use a phrase here called MOMO, and really stands for modernizing the network and monetizing the network. I think if Open RAN stops at only modernizing the network, like Neil was saying, it's not going to be enough. We need to figure out how Open RAN can enable people to monetize the network. And that's really where the app developers have a key role to play. As to why it will happen this time, I think One, the RIC, I think especially is focused on abstracting away all of the complexity of the underlying network, which is a huge barrier to entry for a lot of developers. And the analogy I'd draw is with Twilio, right? So Twilio took SMS. SMS used to be an extremely complex thing for anyone to interact with, abstracted away all of the complexity and exposed it as an API. And look at the number of applications that now use Twilio to build messaging or whatever else into their applications. I think if we want to succeed, we have to build abstractions that do not expose all of the low-level details and let developers monetize the network with interesting capabilities. That's how they'll make money. That's how the network operators will make money. That's how the ecosystem expands. So I think parting shot, let's focus on Momo. How do we modernize and monetize the network?
Great, Sachin, thanks very much indeed. Before we go, because it is almost time for us to go, we must reveal our audience poll for this year's Open RAN Summit. One question, 5 multiple choice answers. It's right here on the website. It's quick and it's easy to complete. And the question we've been asking this week is, which of these is the most important areas of focus for the Open RAN community during the next 12 months? And we've got the current real-time split of opinions right here. Oh dear, it doesn't look too good for security, which is currently in 5th place. But we're going to keep this open all week. Let us know what you think. Click on your answer selection. As I say, we're keeping the polls open all week and we'll come back in on our show tomorrow and have a look to see if those numbers have changed significantly. That's all the time we have for today. It's the end of our first after show for this year's Open RAN Summit. Thanks to everyone who joined us for this live program and our audience for sending in the questions. We extended the length of this show a little bit because we had such terrific discussion going on. We'll be back tomorrow with another live after show program and of course more coverage of Open RAN.
Yes, we have roundtable discussions that look at the Open RAN ecosystem and systems integration challenges, as well as an executive interview with Rakuten Mobile's head of Open RAN, Sushil Rawat. And of course, we also have another live Q&A show where we'll be fielding more of your questions.
We will indeed. So don't forget, please send in your questions as soon as you can. Don't leave it too late. Join us again tomorrow. Goodbye for now.
The after show was recorded in front of a live online audience.